I see many people of the Nietzschean bent take his concept that Socrates was the death of Greece because he replaced the tragic attitude toward life with the rationalistic attitude to an absurd degree where they can't acknowledge that the Socratic process actually has its own value. And it's easy to make that mistake because obviously Nietzsche is suggesting that the engine of Greek culture was the Dionysian cult, where people would, their highest value really was ecstasy. And it was this dissolution, orgiastic ecstasy which fueled their whole culture. And then of course once things had transitioned to Socrates, it's almost a prudishness and a fear about the ecstatic, orgiastic nature of the Dionysian engine of the culture. And once you'd got to Socrates, this is clear. Nietzsche considers that a symptom of a weakened culture, and that's a fair point. But I think when you're considering some of these Nietzschean ideas, one of the things that you have to do is to just be humble and recognize that you probably can't do the highest thing. So Nietzsche's criticizing Socrates because he's less than the highest possible value. But the chances are, for an average person, you're not even as high a value as Socrates. I mean, obviously not, right? So if you want to reject the Socratic idea, this rationalistic view, for something higher, well then you just better take an actual look at your own life and attitude and see where you match up, because you probably aren't the kind of elite human being that can handle for whom the Socratic rationalistic attitude is too little a challenge, right? It probably is a challenge for you because it is for most people. Nietzsche just had extremely high standards for things, and maybe he was a hypocrite. Who knows? You know, you can perfectly argue that maybe he was just being a bit of a resentful dickhead when he was making these comments about Socrates. But nonetheless, I think the relevance there. The point I'm trying to make is that with the current situation in culture, I would say that there are plenty of arguments that you can make against the principle of, say, rational discourse, because it has all these flaws. But the thing is, there really isn't a viable alternative. So, for instance, I see people talk about our democratic system, and they have this belief that democracy isn't enough. You know, we're not going to get anywhere with just democracy and rational debate because it's so sterilizing to the passions. But the thing is, the alternative ends up being something entirely insane. You have, let's go back 100 years. You have fascist ideology throughout a lot of places in the universities and high society, and they would look at democracy and they'd say, well, this is just a stifling institution. What we really need is a valuable institution. We need to make culture the center of value. But then you end up with freaking Nazis and stuff, and that's not good. And that's just a result of thinking that you have a higher value than democracy. So you're going to silence your opposition because you're trying to forward this valuable thing that you have. The thing is that none of those fascist ideologues actually had any value. So I think Nietzsche, for instance, would have seen the actual Nazis had he been alive for them, and he would have dismissed them and thought that they were stupid because he would have just seen their goals as being, decadent and childish and foolish. But the thing is, you can't really have a political movement or a cultural movement that is of a Nietzschean bent, because Nietzsche's whole philosophy is to say that only the rarest and most elite of individuals are capable of generating their own values, or of acting like Zarathustra and being a bridge to new values. So the idea that a significant popular movement is going to be able to embody the highest values is extremely unlikely. So then with the Nietzsche thing, you just go, he wants the same attitude that they had in ancient Greece. worshipping excellence and being fueled by orgiastic desire and ecstasy. But he has no belief that we have enough elite people who would have a sensibility for that in our culture. So the movement can't really be cultural. It has to be really an individual undertaking to try and, create the Übermensch, who would be capable of creating new values. Maybe a sort of fascist, a political movement. If in 1,000 years in the future we come, some of the way towards the Übermensch, then maybe we will have the wherewithal to create a cultural movement, which could set democracy aside and actually do something productive. But we're not there. So I just think it's just important to recognize that any movement that was supposedly fueled by Nietzsche's thoughts on democracy sort of being foolish, it would just come way too short of the mark and would inevitably end up in some incredible, horrific bullshit like with the Nazis. And Nietzsche would obviously say that himself. So, but you see, the same denial of democracy happens on the other side of the spectrum as well, with the more revolutionary, romantic, Rousseauian aspect of culture, where there's this belief that democracy just isn't enough, that all of the oppressions, the axes of oppression, the disadvantages people can experience, all the problems can survive democracy, because the rich and the powerful have more influence over a democratic situation. So, of course, they just look out for their own interests. And what happens is that democracy just isn't enough to dissolve the problems around racism and sexism and class conflict and all these things. And so they just believe that we need to have some new system. Democracy isn't enough because to them the value of these things is more important than democracy. And the thing is, on both sides of the aisle, you can empathize with their perspective, because they're saying, because like on the right, say, or let's say the cultural. How would you even distinguish these things? On the one hand, you have the left, which would be the Rousseauian revolutionary cultural movement, like revolutionary progress, and then on the other hand, you have the right wing, which would be more also revolutionary, because the Nazis did have a revolution, for instance. But it's more of a state-based. We want to organize culture and then go forward with a powerful organized culture. Whereas on the left, it's more we want to dismantle all the problems in culture so that we can shed our chains. And that's the future. Either way, you can empathize with both cases, because it does seem that democracy is stifling both of those processes, in a sense. But the issue is that there isn't an alternative system than rational discourse. Because, as I've said, if you let the right-wing idealism take over, people are too weak and just mentally not... People aren't... they don't have the character. They don't have the strength of character that an ancient Greek leader did. And so they aren't capable of leading a kind of cultural movement towards some high value, because they're just too mentally disorganized. They're deranged. They don't have any values. And then it just inevitably collapses into horrendous crap. And then the same thing on the left. If you set democracy aside because you think it's stifling the liberation of the oppressed peoples, then what ends up happening is you create this bureaucratic nightmare, and your values, again, still aren't properly coherent, and you end up just torturing, imprisoning, and creating all these problems like happened in all the communist countries. So it's important, I think, if you have a Nietzschean persuasion, to look at the problems of liberal democracy and rational discourse, and say, well, these are kind of stifling, these are sterilizing. The human spirit is being denied in order to funnel us into this higher level, supposedly higher level of interaction and communication. But the alternatives are insane. The alternatives are way worse. So, Nietzsche never suggested that the Übermensch would be created by a cultural movement that takes over the government. He said that only the most elite of people would become a bridge to the Übermensch, but that is sort of like the destiny of humankind. It's not that he was morally opposed to the cultural revolutions. It's just that he didn't think they'd go anywhere. So it has to be sort of an individual process by the greatest types of people to bring the Übermensch into existence. And I think it's important to look at rational discourse, liberal democracy, as a cultural institution, and just say, right now, no one can come up with anything better. They're not going to. You can see the flaws. Clearly, it's stifling and sanitizing, and it has all these problems. But there just isn't a viable alternative. So any political movement right now that is trying to slough off democracy as an obstacle is just childish, and it's going to result in horrific tragedies. Because we just don't have the strength of character. No one alive, in politics at least, has the strength of character to organize a positive, actually effective cultural revolution. And no one in culture, no one in the society is either has the strength of character to tell the difference between a good new mode of social organization and an idealistic revolutionary movement which will end up in horrors. No one can tell. So it's just, yes, democracy has problems, but culture, society, psychology are not ripe for a productive revolution. Any revolution that takes place, from whatever perspective, will inevitably produce horrific consequences. So the best we can do, as far as culture goes, broader culture goes right now, is democracy and rational debate. So if people are going to deny the value of rational debate, even though I understand where they're coming from, whatever side of the political spectrum they're from, I get why they're doing it. But if they want to deny the principles of democracy and rational discourse, then all I can say is that if this person of this persuasion forms a movement that takes over culture, the only thing that's waiting for us is horror. Because that's just what happens in these situations. Society is not ripe for a positive revolution. And so it's a difficult situation because on the one hand, I agree with Nietzsche's destruction of democratic ideas and the value of let's say, extra-democratic cultural systems. But at the same time, you have to protect democracy and rational discourse from its attacks from the extremes on both sides of the political spectrum. So it's just foolish, I think, to go about trying to have a revolution or try to get rid of democracy. Because really it's the only thing holding things together. It's the only thing that currently works. And if we go for any more revolutions, then the world will be destroyed. You know, the world has been so close to being destroyed completely with nukes, with the last couple of revolutions. And there are just more nukes now than ever, and people are more insane and unable to... People have even less judgment now than they did then. So, you know, we can't just have this continuous series of revolutions for hundreds and hundreds of years with suffering and torture and horror in the hope that we'll somehow survive. And on the other end of it, we'll have a relatively stable cultural system. Because we probably won't survive. It's probably better to just maintain the slightly sterile, democratic, rational society that we have, and then allow and encourage the greatest people of our era to find a bridge to the new way of doing things. And then once their efforts have yielded fruit, then maybe we can set democracy aside. But right now we are children, and that would just be entirely foolish.